Welcome to the Small Giants Fishbowl. This topic is the Rally of Reell. From being the reason why Bo Burlingham added the 6 but fundamental characteristics of having a sustainable and protectable gross profit margin to a tremendous rally and a rock-solid future, Reell Precision Manufacturing's story is one of twists and turns. Join us as Reell Precision's president and CEO, Kyle Smith, walks you through Reell's story and how their struggles and rebirth connect to the issues of today's entrepreneur. Okay, here we go.
So Kevin, if you want to go ahead and just give us 20 seconds.
Sure. I'm Kevin Lynch with the Center for Values-Driven Leadership at Benedictine. I work on the Return on Values research project and also am co-owner of a small business up in northern Minnesota that's struggling, and we're trying to revive it. So I thought this would be an interesting conversation.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Aaron?
I'm Aaron Moore with Precision Painting, and we're in Chicago, painting and construction company.
Okay. Thank you. Chris?
I'm Chris Manley. I'm with Ingenious. We're a web design and online marketing company primarily focused on serving small businesses and nonprofits, mostly throughout the Southeast.
Great. And Horace?
Hi, Horace Beal. I'm also with Reell. I work with Kyle Smith, and I'm responsible for sales in the transportation and office automation markets.
Great. Horace, I appreciate it. Kyle, if you want to give us a little bit of your biography, and then feel free to go ahead and start your presentation. Have at it.
Hey, thanks for everybody taking the time, and hopefully keep this interactive. So if someone's got a question along the way, but at whatever point, like Glenn said, just hold your hand up, I'll interrupt, be more valuable that way. So a little bit about me. I came to Reell about 9 years ago, and came to Reell not because of the product line they were as a company, and that was very attractive to me. Most of my background is with very large publicly traded companies, and there's certainly good things to be said about that, but there are also things that are a little bit challenging in terms of where my priorities are personally. So thankful for those experiences, and I don't look upon them as bad experiences. They're just different experiences. I'm very fortunate to be at Reell now, and the company is a very interesting company, and we certainly had our share of struggles. I'm sure we'll have more in the future, and that was one of my provisions as I was going through making up the slide deck. I think it's easy to, the best stories are always crafted so that it's just, very clear and binary, because it's easier to consume that way, it's easier to deliver that way. It's rarely reality. And so one of the things that I want to try to caution myself, and as we go through this, it certainly isn't like, everything was bad and now everything is good. So I want to, try to make sure that we've had some learnings along the way, and where I want to get to, I've just got a very short deck to go through today, mostly to give some context. And then the last 2 slides are really where I thought it might be useful to share some experiences of what other people have seen and experienced in their life's journey and business, because we can always learn from each other, and we certainly don't have it all figured out. So that's part of the truth in lending statement. So any questions before we jump into it, or suggestions? Somebody's got. All right, Glenn. So what do I do next here to show slide?
Go ahead and hit share screen, and then share the presentation.
All right, very good. All right, so I can't see it. Can everybody else see it?
Yeah.
Yep. Yes.
All right.
Yep. I could for some.
Kyle, if you want to do us a favor and go ahead and click on your slideshow, hit play so that it goes full screen for you.
There we go. Is that better?
I'm still seeing your toolbar, but if that's okay with you, I think we can work with it. So if you just want to go ahead and rock and roll, go for it.
I'm wondering if it's the multiple monitors. It's just showing up. How's it for everybody else? Everybody else seeing the toolbar too?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's see.
But we are seeing the slideshow, so.
All right, well, let's see. I don't know what I can do about that exactly, but All right, we'll roll with it. If it gets too obnoxious, we'll have to stop and see if we can figure it out. I'm sure it's probably the multiple monitors causing some issues here. Yeah. Okay, well, I guess we'll roll with it and see what happens. A little bit about the background, and again, these first couple of slides are just to kind of get everyone dialed in terms of who Reell is and what we do. So kind of the what part of it, you know, what do we do in terms of output and what do we do in terms of the marketplace? We are focused on very high quality, innovative motion control solutions that are involved in a lot of different industries in the marketplace you sell around the world. We have some patented technology in several different areas. We've got a very talented engineering team. Mostly, if you kind of want to get a bounding of their scope, mostly mechanical engineering. We've hired a fair number of mechanical engineers. We also have some electronics, but we're not heavily dependent on electronics with the exception of some of our automation. And we do sell electromagnetic clutches, but they're fairly simple in terms of the electrical part. The markets that we serve are wide and varied, which keeps it very interesting and challenging. But we are in consumer electronics. We're in automotive. Most of these are interior type areas. Aircraft interiors, these are commercial aircraft, medical, and then in a variety of kind of what I'll say furniture-like settings for industrial. A lot of the data and kiosks that you walk up to in Target and various retail environments, we are in most of those, and architectural lighting, that's actually a very nicely growing area, especially LED lighting. So we position things, we hold things, we prevent excessive force, and simplest idea to kind of get a visualization of it is think of a hinge that moves something from one position to another position very precisely and holds it. So there's a positioning aspect to it, and there's also the ability to prevent excessive motion in terms of torque override. The how piece we'll talk about today as well. 3 mechanical engineers from established Reell. They started at 3M. All of them had careers there at one point. So back in 1970 they started, and from the very beginning they had an idea of what they wanted to do in terms of products, at least starting with a simple mechanical clutch at that time, and they had an idea of how to do that better. So there was this idea of being exceptional at what you do and having very high level of products and services. But they also had some very specific ideas of the work environment that they wanted, and they thought about what they were looking for as an individual of having a balanced life between, you know, family and things outside of work as well as being able to bring their whole selves to work, so that they didn't have to compartmentalize life. So they started off back in '70. Along the way, the name Reell was kind of a natural fit, even though they're not German themselves. Nice. It embodies what they would like to have as the company and how we want to deal with people, no matter what relationship. So we talk about our stakeholders a fair amount, our constituencies, and those are primarily can be categorized simply as customers, our coworkers, which is what we call our employees, our shareholders, the people that own the company, and the company right now is about 50% as an ESOP company, meaning that the trust that the actual coworkers own, and the other half are the 3 founders and their families that have direct shares. The last 2 are our suppliers. We do a lot of design work and we do a lot of assembly work, but we don't do kind of earth, fire, and water where we don't have, you know, rows and rows and rows of CNC machines. We work very closely with our suppliers for powdered metal, stamped steel, various components that we use in our products. Our suppliers are near and dear to us, and we work very carefully with them. We also look at our community, and again, this is going back a long time. So some of this now sounds more normal, but I think when they started, some of this was fairly unusual at the time. Along the way, there are 2 documents that we use as kind of our guidance of how we're going to do business. They're not detailed documents, and I'm not going to go through them in completion today. I'll go through parts of them, but if you want to, I just include the link in there so that you can go to Reell and the whole thing's published there. So one of the documents is our direction statement, and again, you can read, so I'm not going to read through it, but you know, the idea of team as opposed to individuals is a big deal for us. It gets back to humility and saying that no one person, including myself, has a corner on the knowledge. And so we really need and desire a team approach and collaboration to be able to achieve what we want. We've got some very high degree of focus on growth of individuals. So we want people to grow and develop while they're here. And that can take a lot of different paths, but we certainly want people that are very, very competent at what they do. And we also want it to be an area where they feel good about coming to work and they feel like they're growing as an individual over time. So they're not just giving, they are giving their talents, but they're also receiving something in return other than just a paycheck. Here's the constituencies again. You can see that in there. The three guys that started it, the value base is totally Judeo-Christian in terms of the lineage, but we clearly understand that we've got a very diverse community. We've got a wide variety of people that work here at Reell. We've got a facility in the Netherlands, and we do business around the world, and we clearly understand that there's lots of different ways that people come to that. So while we're founded on those values, and we think, I'll show you some transcendent values that we think exist, we clearly understand that people are coming at it from many different angles. So we want an environment where people can work here. It's not going to conflict with their own personal, moral, or ethical issues, family responsibilities, and so forth. And so that's kind of a thumbnail of that. So kind of four basic things that we think translate pretty well anywhere in the world, and it's not specific enough to prevent issues. It's just a framework to have the discussions, is doing what's right. We take that seriously at a company level as well as individual level. And again, that doesn't solve all your problems, because it's entirely possible that two people that are honestly putting their shoulder to the wheel may have different ideas of what that is, but at least it's a place to start. We expect excellence, and we want excellence. We think that that's the way that you want to do things, and that's how you feel fulfilled, is doing your very best and making sure that we're teaching and equipping and having people that can contribute in a way that allows them to use their gifts and talents in a way that really feels fulfilling to them, as well as moving the company forward. You know, very simple, treat others as you would like to be treated. And then we talk about seek inspirational wisdom. And this is kind of the area where a lot of people start getting very squeamish. It's like, oh, let's take the path of least resistance and don't go there. And, you know, we're pretty relaxed about it here. We say, look, if nothing else, we want people to think of it as looking outside of themselves. And it looks different for different people. Some people, it may be teamwork. It may be seeking knowledge from reading things, from understanding things. For other people, it may be prayer. It may be a lot of different forms. But at the end of the day, we don't want people feeling like they can do it all on their own. And it really gets back to collaboration and understanding that none of us have everything that we need, and it just drives that spirit of teamwork. So these are the constituencies, or our stakeholders we talked about. I think those are pretty common at this stage of the game in terms of conscious capitalism and lots of the different venues of promoting that it's not just about one segment. You have to be kind of holistic and systemic when you think about how you do business and who you touch. The next two slides, I'm going to basically skip this one because there's lots of detail here. I don't think it's quite as relevant, but again, we just started in 1970. The one thing I'll just point out is that even early on, when you start a business and you're very, very small, it's not unusual to have, you know, one or two customers that comprise the vast majority of your revenue. And so very early on, they came from 3M, so they knew people there, obviously. And so 3M and Xerox, utilizing these mechanical clutches in their photocopy machines, that was the early customer base. And so not very long after they start, 3M, there's a big hiccup here, big reduction in revenue. And one of the early things that they did that was unusual at the time, it wasn't a large company at that point, obviously, but they didn't go down the path of slicing people off. They instead said, let's see if we can tighten our belts. They thought it was going to be a transient issue. It wasn't a fundamental issue in terms of either, you know, they're making buggy whip, the Model T rolling down the line, or other more systemic, long-going, chronic kind of things. They thought it was a blip in the market. So they chose to take pay cuts. The owners themselves taking the largest pay cuts. And they did this kind of in a collaborative environment. So that was kind of something I'll point out early on. They become an ESOP company in '85. So that was kind of the beginning of a transition plan for the founders. It also sends a message that we want an unusual degree of engagement from our coworkers. We want them to feel like, not just feel like, but we want them to be part of the ownership so that they have a vested interest beyond just a paycheck to care about their company and to do their very best. So I'll go down through, there's various ups and downs. You know, every company can do a timeline and say, here are things, some good things, some tough things. We live in a marketplace, so when there's recessions, yes, it hurts you depending on what markets you're serving and so forth. The other thing I'll point out is that getting back to how they do business, and that was recognized in a couple of different forums in the mid-2000s relative to business ethics awards, and both in Minnesota and as a national level. The last thing I'll just touch on, the business around consumer electronics, specifically with the laptop notebook hinges. That was a very large and growing piece of the business and revenue starting kind of in this kind of time frame. So I'll just point that out as well. Okay, I'll stop for a second. Any questions or anything you want to clarify before I charge it? Okay. So I'm going to zero in kind of on a couple of things. Since we know Bo, we were part of the Small Giants book back in 2005. Quickly thereafter, some very tough things happened, and I'll get into some more detail because I think it's important that we kind of see the context of the issues coming into it before we get to how I got to some of the learnings. And I think then that linkage will make a little bit more sense, hopefully. So traditionally, there have been lots of ups and downs, especially when you're a small and growing enterprise. The P&L goes up and down pretty hard. But the one thing that Reell had always had is a very strong balance sheet. And that was one thing in 2008 that had started to change. The balance sheet, at the time, the CEO faced some very tough decisions because our P&L was no longer going to support the relationship with the bank. The balance sheet started getting leveraged approximately in this time frame. And clearly there were some tough things starting to happen. I think you've all seen the article Paradise Lost that then Bo published in the magazine. And so in 2008, our revenue was at very high levels for Reell in terms of their history, and yet we weren't very financially healthy. And a little over half of our revenue was coming from these notebook hinges, which wasn't an inherently bad thing. You always like growth elements, and it's easy to get enamored with that. However, as in most things, there's a product life cycle, and consumer electronics typically is a very fast product life cycle. And if you kind of look at the DNA of your company, in a little while I'm going to talk about trying to understand your strengths as well as areas where maybe you don't have a good fit with your core competencies. Reell's primary business ventures where they had done well were in things where it was an OEM style business and there was an engagement of engineer to engineer, and they were custom products that might take a while to get into the market, meaning that between sales start and when you start seeing revenue, there was a fairly long cycle for that. So the sales cycle could be well over a year. However, the life cycles were also pretty long. But once you're in there, you had a fairly good continuity of revenue coming from those. Consumer electronics industry, very, very different. Very, very fast cycles to get to market. And the life cycles were also very quick as well. So those were some of the dynamics that were just part of that industry period that we didn't have a good match, at least at that point in time, the company to ride that wave. And then the product life cycle is moving very quickly from we value the best in the world to saying this is a commodity, and you may be the best in the world, but we don't receive value. Our customers don't receive value from that. Moving ahead here, along about 2009, so 2008, a lot of things are happening here. So we got high revenue. We also have, and I'm assuming that most people probably vividly remember it, depending on the area that you're in. But we certainly experienced, along with many other companies, a very rapid downturn relative to the global economic situation. And this started happening kind of late, for us anyway, along about third quarter 2008. So very quickly on, we weren't sure where the bottom was, but it was dropping very, very fast. And so the CEO and the leadership team took pay cuts starting in the month of December. and they were substantial at the time. And again, we're kind of as a preemptive because we weren't really sure, there were so many things going on there with the banks and so forth. It was kind of obvious that this was more than a blip, but we weren't sure where the bottom was. First quarter of 2009, all the coworkers start taking pay cuts except for those at the very lowest levels. Benefits start getting trimmed heavily or just eliminated. And so you can see that, we're starting to ratchet up here because things are not looking good. And keep in mind, we're kind of we were a famished cow going into the drought here, starting with. And that's, I think, an important point to remember. It wasn't just the economic situation. We weren't healthy going into it. First quarter 2009, pay cuts. Second quarter, the board and leadership, substantial changes start to be happening at that point. So we'd already had the second generation of non-family leadership in place, and the board decided to move, and we would appoint the CEO each year, so they just didn't reappoint that year, the current CEO. And so then along the way, mid-year or so, they appointed me as CEO. So that would have been the third generation since the founders were in charge. Later that year, we went into the third round of layoffs. We had reduced operations to 4 days a week, utilizing a Minnesota work share program. Payroll approximately in this time frame was about 50% of where we started at the beginning of 2009. So you can probably see there's just some drastic changes. We had to get a handle on the fixed costs, and it wasn't pretty. Things were not happening the way that you would like to have them happen, at least for Reell. There wasn't much collaboration. It was pretty much like the barn's on fire, there's the door, run. The morale, as you can guess, was just awful, and it was just not fun coming into work. It was a tough point in time. As if that's not enough to deal with, through some of this time frame, there were some patent and contract legal issues that had started even before I got to the company, and they'd been simmering along. Those all came to fruition, and at the end of that, there were just a ton of cost associated with that. So that was a nice bonus. And then along the way, we have to keep in mind that, there's other parts of the business. So in the Netherlands, we had a governance structure that was totally inadequate in my estimation. And so I worked with the board and we restructured that so that we had at least some handle on who could make calls and who needed to be collaborated with, as opposed to each of the two managing directors making calls independently and individually that could bind the entire corporation. So we started trying to deal with some of the governance issues that had kind of been overlooked for a long time. No big shocker. As an ESOP company, we have to get valuation of our stock each year so we understand what the value of the corporation is. So our stock valuation in 2009, we have a fiscal year end of October 31st. When we got the stock valuation, it was basically kind of the asset values. To give you a rough idea, it was the lowest point since the ESOP had begun. There were no salary increases for the last 4 years. The banking relationship was very poor. But other than that, things were pretty perfect. It was very tough environment for everyone. So in 2010, one of the managing directors at the Netherlands facility was released. So there's ongoing structural changes along the way. And in 2010 was when we started trying to say, we've got to chart a different path. So we kind of figured that we had survived the storm, but barely. Grace of God kind of thing. It was really not a good environment at all. So we started laying out a 5-year plan. We worked with the board to say, here's what we think might work, but there's no guarantees because it was going to have some significant implications on the revenue. But it was clear to me that the balance sheet was so leveraged that if we didn't get a handle on things, we'd kind of eaten our seed corn for a long time. So we really took a hard refocus on what is Reell's value proposition. And it wasn't very well aligned with a commodity type business. And what are our core competencies? Where do we add value to the end customer where they would see that value? And how do we want to do business across from that? So we set some margin expectations, and we knew that that was going to result in a decline in revenue because some of our existing customers were no longer going to be customers. And we served them to the end. We didn't drop anybody because that's not how we would do business. But when it came time to quote again on some of the, as an example, the larger volume notebook hinge business, We just didn't quote them because there was no way we were going to be competitive given the market realities. I met personally with some of the larger brands that we were supporting at the time so that they would understand our actions and that we didn't just, not show up to the party one day. They understood what we were doing and why we were doing it. As a result, the balance sheet started to be strengthened a little bit, and certainly profitability improved. We made some changes on the leadership team, and at the end of that year, we had our first profitable year since 2005. And again, everything's not great at this point, but at least you started seeing signs that things were moving in a better direction, and we're able to restore some of the pay cuts, but it had been a very long period of time, so it's still a challenging environment. As you go through, basically, we had 2 years where the revenue declines, but our profitability is going in the right direction. We reduced some debt, paid down some debt. We finally got a meager bonus out in 2011. We got back on the ESOP contributions because that's the other thing that I haven't brought up specifically. But with an ESOP, if you don't make regular contributions to the ESOP, it can snowball and take you down. So it's a great structure to have involvement, but it also is a little precarious because if you grow too fast or too slowly, ESOPs are challenging to manage. The morale is slowly starting to get better. No one wants to work in a losing environment, and so we're starting to get a little bit more zip in our step, but we still have a long ways to go. But we started seeing, we do have a coworker survey that it's in the previous slide, but in 1998, the board decided that they wanted to say, how are we doing with our direction statement? And is it just hanging on the wall, or are we abiding by it? How do the employees see that, or coworkers? So every year we take that and the board reviews the information, and it's taken very seriously. And that year we had a big uptick in that. And so that was at least a good indication that people were starting to feel more engaged again and a little bit better about life. So anyway, finally in 2013, we start seeing the revenue turn the corner. Profitability is still continuing to do well, and stock value went up about 143% since that low point in 2009. We're still innovating hard. We've got some pretty sizable investments in our engineering so that we continue to innovate. So we're not just trying to have a rebound and have it last for a year or two. We're trying to think long term. That's one of the things that I really appreciate about the ownership structure at Reell, is that they are thinking long term. For a quarter, they're not worried about a quarter. They're worried about long term and what's going to be best long term, as well as being healthy in the short term. Right now, we're really pushing hard on training. That was something that I think kind of lost its way. When you're not profitable, it's hard to invest in those types of things, and yet you pay the price when you don't. And so we kind of launched a company-wide initiative last fiscal year. And there's 7 modules. It'll take us about 2 years to get through all of them, and they're wide-ranging from kind of, here's our culture and leadership style that we like at Reell, and here's why, to engineering, sales, operations, and so forth, our ESOP training. So there's 7 different modules that everybody, including myself and the company, will go through. And this year, we just finished our fiscal year, and we had a blessed with a great year. We had 16% above where we were a year ago, and our profitability is even better. So things are good right now. I'm sure we'll go through some more challenges in the future. Every day is a new day, and none of us get promises, but at least feels like we've got some health back. The balance sheet's in good shape now, very solid, and we have wherewithal to move ahead. So I'm going to jump in now into kind of some of the learnings, and I put relearning because sometimes learning is, there's nothing magical in these slides. So I'll stop for a moment and see if anybody's got any questions or anything you want me to go back over in any of these.
Actually, I want to ask, Kyle, will you be willing to share the survey that you do with your employees and this and any additional information on the modules that you would be willing to share with this group?
Yeah, I think certainly I'll be happy to send out the presentation. The survey is against our direction statement, so I don't know the broad applicability, but certainly I can send you the questions that we ask. We've kept continuity of the questions so we can kind of see a graph, over time, how we doing up or down. And then recently we started adding on just 2 or 3 specific questions that the management can utilize to kind of get more, like for instance, we talked about, do you trust senior management? And so we did that one last year. And so they're kind of more pointed things that we can look at and say, how are we doing against those, as well as trying to get some heartbeat. So I certainly can, that won't be a problem to share. Here's the basic survey, and I'll give you some ideas of a couple of the more transient questions that we've asked over the last year or two. And what was the third one you asked?
The training modules.
Well, the training modules. Yeah, I can give you a list of what we're training through. And again, like one of them's ESOP, and so if you're not an ESOP company, that's not really useful. But be happy to share those.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Go for it, Aaron.
All right, cool. So I wanted to ask you that training thing too. I wanted to ask, because we're always working on that, and it's one of our biggest struggles is, so the 7 modules, you've been in business for a long time, but your business has changed. Did you start from scratch with these modules? Did you have did you use some sort of template that was like, here's HR training, or here's, how did you get it from 0 to 7 modules that takes 2 to 3 years to complete?
Yeah, good question, Aaron. We sat down, the leadership team sat down and said, okay, what are the basic things that we want to train on before we worried about the how piece of it? So what do we really want to hit on? And that's kind of established what those 7 modules, kind of the titles, so to speak. And then we ask each person that and so they wind up kind of almost being functional, with the exception of, for instance, like the ESOP. And so we wanted the owners of that to work with their team to develop, what do you think the salient, again, kind of thinking of it as a college 101 class. So they're not meant to be, incredibly in depth. And so like on the sales one, Horace and the rest of his colleagues, participated in that. And we actually had some, they chose in theirs to have some kind of role playing. And so we literally had people on the floor trying to sell things to other people and so forth. And it's not to make them into salespeople, it's to give them a flavor and a respect for, what other people in the company do, and a little bit about how they go about it. So it's kind of that first layer of training. And so we had each functional leader develop the information that's in there. And so for instance, in sales, the vice president of global sales and customer service was tasked, if you will, of saying, you got to come up with something that can be delivered in approximately an hour. And we need to cover the points so that they walk away, no matter what their role is in the company, they will walk away with an understanding, at least an initial understanding of what the people in that area do and how it impacts the company. And that last part was the big thing of engagement. So they kind of understand, oh, okay, that's what happens when these guys are traveling all over the place and we hear about these opportunities, and it helps them understand it. So we didn't have really a tight, canned, here are the templates to fill out. I think there's probably a possibility that in some companies that'd be a really efficient way to do it. We didn't go down that route. And the only other thing I'd say is this was kind of the fundamental building blocks that we wanted to go after. We're having other training. In fact, when I get done with this, I'm going to go to a training. It's the second part of one that we've got a person coming in from the outside training on effective listening skills. And so we're really going after the training pretty hard because we really want to equip people and we want them to feel, like they're learning things and adding things to their tool belt. So these 7 modules are kind of the foundation piece of it, but there's other training that's going on, obviously, in addition to that.
Great.
Okay. The last 2 pages hopefully will be kind of things that we can kick around here a little bit, because I think everybody will possibly have different ideas, different experiences. And so this certainly isn't, won't be entirely applicable to everyone. But these are the things that I did. And I actually wrote a document to myself back in the middle of 2009 while the wounds were raw and painful, of, what am I learning through this process? And some of it was probably cathartic to survive. But on the other hand, you do learn things sometimes when things are tough, and it's easy to forget those when things are better. And I didn't want to lose sight of that. So I literally pulled that document up when I was making these next 2 slides so that it's kind of fresh from the 2009 timeframe. But I think the first one I started off with, and these aren't necessarily in order, but this one was very important to me, was trying to understand, and realistically, and I think sometimes you need to ask some of if you've got really close customers that'll be very candid with you, this is really helpful too, because it's sometimes tough on the inside to really understand this differentiated value. And what I mean by that is, what do you offer your customers that maybe no one else in the world can do exactly like that. And being realistic and saying, look, there's a lot of people that have mechanical engineers in the world. We do have a little bit of an advantage that we're kind of in a niche market. We don't have hundreds of people playing in our market, but we do have some very good people that are in several different parts of the world that can do what we do. And so where do we really give something that's differentiated to that customer that they can see and they're willing to pay for that? And where, honestly, are you a commodity and you have to price your things as a commodity? And so just getting a clear grip on that was a big deal. And out of that, I think you can create a profile of saying, what's a great customer for my business? Because you can't be all things to all people. I mean, it's just, unless you're a Microsoft or something, and even there, you see the difference between Apple and Microsoft. You kind of have to know where your sweet spot is and then go after that with great gusto. But it allows you to narrow down the focus of who is, what would constitute a good customer, and where's they're a great person, they're a great business, but we really can't add value to them the way that they do things. And so it's just better to not waste their time and your time on that. Once you kind of have a good handle on number one, I think that's where when you go to sessions that are around pricing, it's kind of a general thing that people in general are a little hesitant about asking for fair pricing. Once you get an idea on number one, I think you can ask for fair pricing. Reell is certainly not the cheapest place around. We try to be fair. We don't want to just gouge people, so I'm not heading down that path. But we're not bashful about asking for a differentiated pricing where we provide differentiated value to that end customer. And similarly, kind of corollary to that, if you're selling a commodity, you got to be very competitive on your pricing with that. And so those 1 and 2 kind of go together. So any other thoughts or comments on that? Okay, the third one is where I think, quite honestly, there was some challenges in the past at Reell, is that even if you're a very culture-rich, people-centric, values-based company, that can become the focal point, and it still is a focal point at Reell. I hope it never changes. That's one of our desires, is to maintain this. However, with that said, you still have to be very prudent in the way that you manage the business. It's not an optional activity. If you have no financial health, you can't even do the things that you would like to do as this, values-centric, culture-rich company. It's not the means to the end, because that's not our purpose at Reell, to maximize shareholder value. On the other hand, it is an absolute requirement that you're financially healthy to have a good environment for the coworkers. You can't serve your customers well if you're, barely scraping by. You can't touch the community. As an example, we're sending a team down for the 3rd year down to the Dominican Republic, and the only thing that the coworker has to do is use some of their vacation and come up with a passport, and we pay for the rest of it to help build some schools down there for a very impoverished area down there. And so it's another ancillary piece of what we do, but you can't do those kind of things or some of the local things that we do for the community if you're barely scraping by. And so we always want to have a culture of giving back, but if you don't make any profits, you can't give back. And so that's something that I don't ever want to lose sight of. I don't want to get it mixed up either, because we're not a drive financial health at all costs kind of company, but it also is easy to get into the ditch of that's the only thing that matters, and you're not doing a good job of managing the business. Next one on resources. No matter what size company you are, you're just never going to have enough resources. And so it's just this ongoing prioritization, I think, of saying, focus on profitable business growth and not just growth. And so again, it kind of ties back to what fuels number 3, and you have to have profits in order to make the world go around. It doesn't mean that here and there, but you have to be very careful about it and not kid yourself. There may be a strategic reason that you want to go after a certain business to grow in a certain segment, or a certain customer is critical to you. So always there's exceptions to all these things, but in general, we want to try to use our resources for profitable business growth. And if something's going through a life cycle, you have to acknowledge that and then move to something else and continually remake yourself. The number 5 is basically around, everybody knows that communication's is vital, no matter whether it's your marriage or other relationships with your kids or whatever. It's a big deal, and it's always going to be a challenge. It's just communications are simple to say. We all know it intuitively, but it's just tough. One of the things that I think also contributed to some of the challenges that Reell had was just having, I put unvarnished here, just clear communications without a lot of spin on it. Just share what's going well and be candid about that, and then also share what's not going well. And at any given time in most businesses, you have a little bit of both going on. I think that transparency, number one, it's freeing, because it's just the truth's the truth, and you don't have to figure out what did I tell them. You just replay the tape again, because that's what reality is. I think ultimately that builds up a lot of credibility and trust. And we think a lot about, our shareholders, the board, leadership team, the coworkers, our vendors. I didn't put that on here, but that's obviously a case too. Just tell them what's going on, and don't put a lot of flowers around the edges of it. And most of the time, they may not like the story, but at least you're telling them, at best you know it at that time, what you believe to be truth. We use a variety of forums. We have monthly all-company meetings here at Reell, and they're short, and so they're hardly ever exhaustive by any stretch. But we share all of our financials, so kind of getting back to Jack Stacks, share, have transparency in your financials and understanding the financials. We certainly abide with that and align with that, and it's not a new thing at Reell. It's been done for a long time. And we share, various functional updates and so forth, and at the all-company meetings. I provide an executive summary each month to the directors. It's usually 3 to 5 pages. Certainly there are financial piece there, but our CFO does a good job of providing more detail on the P&L as well as balance sheet and other specifics. But I also use it as a way to discuss other aspects of the sales, and I circulate that to the leadership team. They review it, can make comments. You say, I think you didn't present that clearly, or here's some additional information we think should be included. And it's just a way to keep a touch point there. Obviously, board meetings, and I specifically put that one on there. It's an obvious one. But again, I think it's easy to start controlling information, and I think that happened when things were getting kind of ugly. It was very easy to say, let's manage the communications. And while it may be an easier way to do it, I don't think it's a good idea. I invite the board to talk to anybody they want. They can talk to the leadership team. Several of them know people here at Reell. They can talk to people. Is there a possibility they may get a slightly different story? Well, yeah, it absolutely is. And sometimes that creates some issues, but I'd rather deal with those issues, because it's the old adage of, if all of us on this call watch an accident happen out on the street corner outside of your office, your home, and then we replay the tapes and say, what'd you see, Aaron? What'd you see, Kyle? What'd you see? We go around the room, Glenn may have a little different version of what he saw versus Horace versus me versus, and that doesn't mean somebody's lying. It's just, we all focus on some different things. And I think there's some health in the breadth of that. And again, it gets back, if you have a trusting environment, you can get through those differences. So if somebody hears something a little different, yeah, maybe there's value in that too, because maybe that's an emphasis that I didn't put enough emphasis on, and then you get a more complete story at the end of the day. And then finally, this thing with listening, when you have lots going on and there's limited amounts of time, it's very easy to not listen carefully. But I think, if you take some time and listen, it's a good thing for everybody at the end of the day, because you can learn a lot. It sends a message of respect to the others that have things that they're quite knowledgeable about, and it's a good environment, but it's hard to do. It's just a challenge because time's always tight, and we all we want to get our thing in. So instead of listening to the end of the sentence, we're formulating a response, formulating a rebuttal or whatever, instead of just listening to them and then pausing and say, okay, let's where do we go from here? The last one on this page is process, and I think this is an ongoing thing of how much is enough and how much is too much, and I think there's dangers in both sides of that. I list a few things there that I think are important to have some process around, and again, this is from the Reell experience. We had very great intentions around personnel and how we treat people. When I got to Reell, I was just literally kind of in horror. I was just kind of in a state of horror relative to we our record keeping was just awful. We didn't have good processes, and so we had great intentions, great hearts, but very little framework to do it consistently over time. And once you get to some size, you just have to have a better process of doing things, or otherwise you can't have consistency and fair treatment. So the rest of those, I think, are fairly self-evident. Any questions on this slide or other thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I had a question, Kyle. For number 3, where having a direct focus on the financial management, how was it not there? Because I can't imagine just not being there. But was it just not a cornerstone when you were going through most of those struggles? And from there, how did you take that communication really into the employee base so that it was championed and understood, like this is a fundamental part of what we're doing here, and we can't do anything else without this?
Yeah, that's a really insightful question, because I think it's easy to take what I've said so far and assume that like people were asleep at the switch, or we didn't show financial information or something. And so I'm glad you asked the question so I can kind of clarify a little bit. To be clear, there's always been financial records, and actually from a pure number standpoint and the rigor around it, pretty impressive, given that it started out as a very small company and people kind of grew up through the ranks. And so when I got here and started asking a bunch of questions around the financials and historicals and so forth, there was lots of information there. And so it was not sloppily run. There was clearly some decent business acumen in terms of the financial ability to pull information together and have clarity. There was never any hint of cooking the books kind of a thing. But I think going from what the numbers are and then articulating that clear communication that I talked about in number 5, somewhere in that piece is where I think some of the challenges kind of emerged. So instead of saying, this is the, this is a 12th straight month that we've increased our revenue and we're still losing money, I think a lot of the coworkers at the time were probably on it faster than the board, to be quite honest. And I'm not sure, I wasn't a part of the insides of the board at that time to really give any insight. But the time frame of saying danger, and making action of some kind to acknowledge that it wasn't working seemed to be too long of a time delay. And I think, many of the coworkers, even at the assembly kind of level, were saying, guys, do you understand that we're losing money and continuing to lose money, and we just keep pushing the pedal down more and selling more of those things that aren't making us money, and how does this work? And so I don't think it was an absence of information, because I quite honestly, I don't think that was the issue. It was looking at that and then constructing a story saying, you can dress this up however you want, but it's not pretty and we're not going in the right direction, and you have to deal with that. And so kind of taking a very, very optimistic view to it doesn't remove the reality that we're in the red and we need to change some things in order to fix that. So I think it was really responding to it as opposed to absence of information. So when I talk about robust financial management, it's really making sure that not only are you just generating the numbers, but then you're acting on that. And it isn't in replacing, the culture or saying it's not important to follow what you want to be as a company, but it's certainly making sure that you're taking the time to understand the layers below the numbers. And is it just a spike? Because not every month's going to be a great month. But is there just a spike and you can understand it? Or are you really trying to rationalize some real problems and cracks in your foundation? And there's a big difference there, and it's easy to kind of slowly slide into something that's long-term going to be really damaging to your company and ultimately to the people that you're supporting there. So I don't know, does that help a little bit?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's I think that was maybe where a little bit of my confusion is, and I think sometimes when folks are looking at that specific type of issue, where some confusion may come along. So that was perfect. And before I ask more questions, I wanted to give everyone else a chance to hop in with a question, because I definitely have a few more in the 2 minutes that we have left. But I wanted to give another voice a chance to hop in. Otherwise, I've got at least one more question. So Aaron, Horace, Kevin, Chris, anything?
Go ahead, Glenn.
We've talked a lot about looking at how leadership's developed, and there's been a dramatic focus on, again, the training elements, how to communicate, what you should be communicating, processes. What are the resources that you looked to both internally and externally, whether it be a book or guides? And I'm going to guess that the Great Game of Business is probably one of them. But what are the resources that you referenced as part of this turnaround that folks should check out?
Yeah, I think, certainly Great Game of Business is a phenomenal place to start. And I think, that kind of sets a great foundation for the basics, building blocks. Past that, I think there's certainly a variety of, and some of it's just kind of accumulated knowledge, just things like this fishbowl, and going to certain conferences and learning from other people, it kind of accumulates. And so I don't know that I have a great, here's the 5 things that I use kind of thing, but I can tell you, I think, it certainly wasn't just me. And so this idea of leveraging a bunch of people, and we won't have time to go through it, but this last one down here, or number 13, being humble and then leveraging the collective knowledge. So as an example, I think human resources, we call it coworker services because we like this idea of serving other people, but I think that's an area that gets kind of trivialized in a lot of companies, and it becomes a transactional thing of hire, fire, benefits, administration, and you go there for the 911 call when, Billy's not acting right and misbehaving and that kind of stuff. I think if you look at it, you got people, and people really are your most important thing. You say, well, why shouldn't they be at the table every bit as much as the, leader of sales or leader of technicians or the technical piece or the financial, the CFO and so forth. And so we look at that piece of it very differently, in this training and development that's in their domain. And so they're trying to say, how do we move people ahead? And they were very instrumental in saying, we need a budget that everyone that, fills out a simple form, and if it's going to benefit the company and it benefits, we've got people, going after their degrees, and we've had a couple of different degrees already granted. And they've got, we have a very rich training budget relative to companies our size. And so it gets back to this, reinvesting in people. And I think, could they leave? I've got to ask a question, recently by a colleague, do we make them sign a commitment that they stay here for a certain number of years? Well, I don't know that we'll never do that, but right now we don't, because I do think that, keeping a great environment, that's how you keep people. And I don't want people here that don't want to be here. And I hope that it's a place where people can grow and develop and they want to reinvest. And so if they get their degree, hopefully they say, wow, Reell treated me well. I've got things I can do here now that I didn't before, and you continue that growth and development. So long answer and incomplete because I didn't give you here's the 3 punch list, but I do think, leveraging collective knowledge, including colleagues that you trust outside of your enterprise, can be hugely helpful. And so I try to stay networked to some reasonable degree, because they can sometimes bring a sober reality that maybe you lose in the day-to-day, machinations of the company. So I think, listening to other people and how they're doing it, and even forums like this, are quite helpful.
Okay, well that's it for this one. Check out more Fishbowls exclusively for the Small Giants community at smallgiants.org.